Tonight's report concerns a crossroads tavern with no door, a medical crystal with too many friends in high places, and a bard who mistook bureaucratic sabotage for audience engagement. There are towns you pass through because you must, and towns you pass through because you have attempted to pass through other towns and failed in ways that felt personal. This particular place was a three-horse settlement that insisted on calling itself a junction, and did so with the confidence of a puddle describing itself as an ocean. It clung to the crossroads like lint to a cloak. Caravans stopped here not because the tavern was good, but because the alternative was sleeping outdoors, with your face as the local wildlife's evening entertainment. The tavern was called the Hole in the Wall, which was not a metaphor. It had in the external wall a hole. Where doors normally go in sensible architecture, there was instead an absence that had been reinforced by tradition, stubbornness, and at least one building inspector who had stared at it for a long time and then quietly written the word unfixable in his ledger in a way that suggested he wished it had been a different career.
Inside, the hole in the wall was warm, loud, and full of the kind of people who looked as though they had arrived by accident and were not entirely certain they had done so legally. There were merchants who smiled like they were selling you something, even when ordering stew. There were drovers who smelled like they had never met a bathtub and had strong opinions about that. There were a pair of petty clerks on their way to anywhere else, and a single unremarkable courier who had the posture of a man who had been paid to be forgettable. The courier was not from the capital. He was from wherever the recipient of his message needed him to be. This was a talent in itself. He wore no colors, carried no sigils, and had only one remarkable habit. He did not read messages intended for other people. He also knew, as anyone who has carried written instructions across 3 counties knows, that paper does not like being trusted. It tears, it burns, it gets soggy, it gets eaten by goats, it gets chewed by horses, it gets sat on, and in rare cases it becomes enthusiastic. But none of that was his concern tonight. Tonight his concern was ale and a bard.
Jack M. Igor arrived through the hole in the wall with the briskness of a man trying to outrun a song. He wore the weary confidence of a performer who had been applauded often enough to believe he deserved it, and the faintly hunted expression of someone who had recently heard a voice, far away, drifting over rooftops, that he refused to name. He carried 2 instruments. One was a set of small pipes, neat and practical, the sort you could play in the rain and still look tragically competent. The other was a litar, a lyre-guitar hybrid whose name had, in certain towns, been misheard as litter by people who believed that was an extremely witty way to describe music they did not personally enjoy. Jack did not mind. Next to the many other things he did not mind, it was almost comforting. He paid up front. This was not required by the innkeeper, who was, by local standards, an honest man, and was therefore regarded with suspicion. But musicians pay up front because musicians, like fire, are useful and unpredictable. Jack did not like owing anyone anything. He believed this made him principled. It mostly made him predictable. He took the small platform near the hearth, tuned his litter with the air of someone whispering apologies to wood, and looked out over the room with a professional smile that had been practiced in mirrors and perfected in panic. A bard playing in a crossroads tavern is a strange kind of civic service. You are there to varnish the rough edges of travel, to turn muddy boots into dancing feet, to make strangers laugh at the same moment so they forget they would normally argue, to make hearts soften, wallets open, and arguments pause long enough for someone to drop a coin. Jack was exceptionally good at this. He was also, as previously discussed, an emotional creature. This did not fuel his magic, but it did make him do things like smile too widely, take rejection personally, and occasionally drink as though he were trying to drown his own thoughts. His magic was in the music, his mastery was in the structure, his accidents were in the consequences.
He began with something safe, a jaunty tune about a cart that rolled downhill and ended up married. The room warmed to it in the way rooms do when someone else takes responsibility for joy. Stew tasted better.
Ale tasted kinder. A man at the bar began to believe that perhaps he was, in fact, a decent person, and not merely a collection of grudges in boots. Jack watched the room the way a fisherman watches the river. He was looking for the current. He found it. And then, because he wanted money, applause, and at least one attractive stranger to regret something later, he did what bards always do when they think they have a room. He asked them to sing along. "It's easy," he said, with the confidence of a man who has never been on the wrong side of a choir. "Just the chorus, the bit you can't help but remember. That's the point of a chorus. If you forget it, it's not a chorus, it's a complaint." There was laughter. There were groans. There were, crucially, nods. Jack launched into the song. It was a traveler's tune, catchy as infection. The chorus was designed to stick. And because Jack believed himself to be merely very talented, he did not realize that when he asked a room to sing, the rooms sometimes obeyed in more ways than one. At first, it was normal. Mouths opened. Voices joined. A table was thumped in rhythm.
Someone attempted harmony and failed in a way that suggested they had fought harmony personally in the past. Then, quietly, so quietly that no one noticed because they were busy having fun, words began to move. Not the spoken words, the written ones. Ink on paper has a complicated relationship with the world. It wants to be true. It wants to stay still. It wants to mean what it meant when it was written. And it also, if you listen closely, wants to be listened to. When the chorus hit the second time, the tavern's menu shifted. Not in a dramatic way. No smoke, no sparks, no choir of angels. Just the list of stews became a list of syllables. Mutton stew became, oh no. Root vegetables became, roots, don't you doubt. The innkeeper blinked at it, decided he must have spilled something on it earlier, and carried on. A love note on the table near the hearth sighed softly and rephrased itself into the chorus, which, in hindsight, was a better use of its paper. A debt ledger behind the bar attempted to resist and failed. Every line became the same repeating refrain.
And in the courier's satchel, tucked between spare socks and the sense of a man who had stopped expecting the world to be polite, a sealed communique rewrote itself. It did this through wax, through fold, through careful handwriting. Because the chorus did not care what you had intended. The chorus cared what you were singing. The courier drank his pint. He slept. He did not open the message. He did not check the seal. He did not notice that the paper in the tavern now carried Jack's song like a mild infection. In the morning, he left. This is how most disasters begin, with a man doing his job properly. Far away, so far away that the road between here and there existed mostly as bureaucratic paperwork, Francis Urukheart was plotting. Plotting is what people call it when someone wealthy and powerful lays out a plan they are proud of. When poor people do the same thing, it is called trying to survive, and is considered less admirable. Francis Urukheart did not often go to crossroads taverns. He did not often go anywhere that smelled like honest labor. He existed instead in the spaces where decisions were made with ink, seal, and silence. He was, as most people knew, one of the untouchable wizards. Not like Mortimer, who made mountains like a man building a shed and then forgot he'd done it. Francis was different. Francis saw the world as a board. Politics was only one subsection of the game. He liked resistance, but not rivals. He liked domino effects. The ideal move, to Francis, was touching one stone and watching 16 different lines fall in patterns only he had designed. And tonight,
he was trying to protect a crystal. It was a medical crystal, imported via the harbor in the capital, and it had the irritating habit of making itself useful. It eased headaches, it dulled chronic pain, it soothed the nervous tremors that came from living in a world where magic could ruin your day without asking. It also made certain people very rich. Francis was one of those people. A magistrate, in an earnest mood, and with a sincere belief that government should do more than embellish paper, had been lobbying the Ministry of Magical Administration to push for a ban. Not a direct ban. That would require laws, and law in this empire did not exist in the way it was supposed to.
Instead, it existed as aspiration, a dream the state had about itself. The MMA, being bureaucratic and corrupt in a way that alternated between effective and utterly useless, could not enact law. But it could drown people in process. It could stall. It could slow. It could advise. And in the empire, advice from a ministry tended to become policy through sheer exhaustion. Francis needed that advice to go the other way. So he arranged a sequence. 4 voices. 3 people the department head did not trust, each vouching for the magistrate's integrity, and 1 person the department head did trust, who would, carefully, gently, plant the hint. Perhaps the magistrate was making a play for power. Not a claim, not an accusation, just a suspicion. A small stone that would, if placed correctly, set off 16 lines of dominoes. It required timing, not simultaneous pressure. A sequence. First reassurance from distrusted mouths, then precisely when the department head began to feel annoyed by how predictable everyone was being, a trusted voice would arrive with uncertainty. Uncertainty is a wonderful tool. It invites paranoia to do the work for you. The communique contained the instructions for that trusted voice. A few sentences, a schedule, a phrase to use, a reminder to appear reluctant. And now, thanks to Jack M. Igor and the democratic ambitions of a sing-along chorus, it contained lyrics. In the small city where a festival was approaching, and with it crowds, officials, speeches, and the kind of civic optimism that always ends in spilled ale, the intended recipient broke the wax seal. He was a proxy, not magical, not officially affiliated, just a man paid to be involved without being accountable. He unfolded the paper. He read, "Oh, down the road and through the night." He blinked. He read it again. He checked the seal. Perfect. He checked the handwriting. Correct. He checked the paper for invisible ink. None. He checked whether he was dreaming. He was not. This is the moment where competent people do something difficult. They act. They improvise. They take responsibility. This man did not. Not because he was malicious. Not because he was lazy. Because he was rational. The rational response when you receive nonsensical lyrics in place of instructions from an untouchable wizard's network is to stop moving and try not to attract attention. So he did nothing. He stayed put. He tried to interpret the lyrics. He considered whether the chorus might be a code. He considered whether the code might be a test. He considered whether the test might be punishment. He considered whether the safest move was to burn the paper, eat it, or become a priest. Meanwhile, time passed, and the sequence did not begin. And the MMA, which did not require perfect timing to begin pushing for a ban, began pushing. Paper moved. Meetings formed. Concern was expressed. Committees were assembled. Minutes were taken. The ban gained momentum the way a boulder gains momentum, slowly at first, and then all at once. Francis did not hear about the failure from the people involved. He heard about it the way powerful people hear about reality,
as rumor. A merchant's cousin mentioned that the MMA was suddenly very interested in medical crystals. A minor official remarked, over wine, that the magistrate had found unexpected support.
A clerk complained, privately, that there were forms now. Francis listened. Not with panic, with annoyance. Then he asked questions. Questions are another kind of magic. He sent them down his network, and they returned with answers that had been scraped out of the world. The communique, the seal, the lyrics, the Crossroads Tavern, the bard, Jack M. Igor. Francis sat very still. He stared at the man telling him the story. He performed a facepalm, then a double facepalm. Then, with the steady resignation of someone watching 16 domino lines fall in the wrong order, he lowered his head to his desk. He stayed there. The man waited. Powerful people take breaks differently. When Francis finally lifted his head, his expression was calm. This was worse than anger. "Fine," he said. He did not say Jack's name. Saying Jack's name would have made it real. Instead, he did what practical evil always does when elegance fails. He used leverage. He had already had digging done into the Minister for Magical Administration, because if you rely on a ministry, you should always know what it relies on.
And the minister, despite his public posture of duty, his private speeches about civic order, and his professional love of forms, had headaches. Bad ones. Headaches that made light feel like knives. Headaches that turned meetings into torture. Headaches that, inconveniently, were soothed by the very same medical crystal under discussion. Francis did not need to threaten him. He did not need to bribe him. He did not need to do anything so obvious. He simply arranged, through a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a subsidiary, that the minister be reminded. Of relief, of supply, of the quiet personal cost of losing access. The MMA retracted support for the ban with remarkable speed. There were memos. There were clarifications. There were committees that quietly dissolved. There were departmental heads who discovered suddenly that the magistrate had overstated the urgency. It was effective. It was also inelegant. It left fingerprints. Francis disliked fingerprints. So he updated procedure. Handoffs would be done at the start of the day. Tavern stays would be pre-handoff, never post. Couriers would not linger.
And if they did, they would linger somewhere without music. This, Francis assumed, would solve the Jack problem. It would not, but for now, it made him feel like he had put the world back into a shape he recognized. Jack, for his part, did not know any of this. He went on to the small city for the festival, took coin from strangers, took admiration from people who were easier than remorse, and drank with the steady commitment of a man trying to drown ordinariness. Some days later, he came back through the hole in the wall. The tavern was quieter. The innkeeper was scrubbing a table. A few scraps of paper lay around the room. Jack picked one up. It was covered in his chorus. He picked up another. Also the chorus. A third. More chorus. He paused. He looked around. He smiled, softly, with the deep satisfaction of a man whose greatest fear is being ordinary and whose greatest drug is being remembered. "Well," Jack said, to no one in particular, and therefore to the universe at large, they really, really liked that one. He tucked the paper into his coat like a trophy. And the world, which had been rearranged by a song and a wizard and a ministry and a headache, carried on pretending that everything was normal.